There are mixed reactions to the recently signed Companies Act. Local companies will now have to disclose the pay gap between their highest and lowest paid workers. The labor unions have also welcomed the act, saying it will help root out corruption, among other things. To tell us a bit more about the act and who it will benefit, I am joined by André de Lange, who's a director and a corporate and commercial, this at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr. A pleasure to have you on the program this evening, André. Firstly, how do you assess the potential impact of this new legislation on corporate transparency in the country? Will it effectively achieve its goal of really improving visibility into executive compensation?
Good evening, Tlantla. Thank you for having me. I think firstly it's just important to note that although the Act has been signed by the President into law, it is not yet operational. So we're still waiting for the President to determine the implementation date of the Act. So it's not, although it's already an Act, it's not operational yet. I think that's the first point. So I think definitely the Act does provide for better transparency in companies. I think it provides that in three different areas. The first one is in respect of remuneration, and that applies to public companies and state-owned companies where you have to prepare a remuneration policy and a report, and you have to actually get that approved by your shareholders. Then in respect of the Social and Ethics Committee, that report now has to be presented to shareholders. And a further aspect of the Act is that the annual financial statements of public companies and larger private companies would now be accessible by members of the public. So that is something that is quite different to the old regime. I think, I definitely think that the Act will lead to greater transparency of executive pay. It requires in this remuneration report for the total remuneration of executives to be disclosed, and the definition of total remuneration is very wide, and it would include probably most of the type of remuneration that will be payable to directors and prescribed officers.
Mr. de Lange, what are some of the major risks or unintended consequences that companies might face with this new pay gap disclosure requirement? Are there specific examples where similar laws have led to negative outcomes?
Yes, I think that obviously the Act is aimed at reducing the gap between the highest earners and the lowest earners, and that's a very laudable objective. Whether the Act is going to achieve that is a different story. I think, you know, there are other ways. Unintended consequences could be that companies would actually get rid of the lower, the very low earning employees, or perhaps outsource those types of services so that they do not have to disclose that in their remuneration reports. There are instances where there has been unintended consequences. For instance, currently the Companies Act does provide for certain companies to disclose the remuneration of their directors in their annual financial statements. And the question is whether that has that led to a reduction in senior executive payments. I don't think so. Often what happens is other companies look at that and almost use it as benchmarks for their own remuneration. So instead of having a downward pressure, disclosures like that can sometimes have an upward pressure.
I want us to get more emphasis on the point that you're making. Do you believe that this new law will have a substantial impact on the levels of executive compensation? And how might remuneration committees even adjust their policies in response to public disclosure?
Yeah, I would actually, I don't think, in my own view, I don't think that it will have much of an impact on the top executive pay. I don't think so. Hopefully it will have an impact on the lower remuneration. Hopefully companies would, when they have to disclose these figures, and I think in a country like South Africa, there would probably be quite significant discrepancies between the lowest and the highest, that hopefully that would lead companies to look at the lower remuneration and do something about that. The shareholders obviously also play a role in this because they ultimately have to approve the remuneration policy, and they can actually use their vote to actually place pressure on the companies to do the right thing.
Andre, in preparing for this interview, we also learned that companies might respond by outsourcing lower level jobs to really manage their pay ratios. How significant do you think this is, or this risk is, and what can be done to mitigate against it?
I think it's definitely a risk. It is definitely a risk that companies could do that, especially if if their remuneration gaps are very significant and they're quite almost embarrassed to disclose that. So I think it can happen. Whether there's a lot of mitigating factors, whether you can stop that, I'm not too sure about that, because there's often other good commercial reasons why companies outsource services. And it might be difficult, and one of the reasons could be this, but there might be other good reasons. So it will, I think, quite difficult to really govern that. And perhaps in the Labour Relations Act there could be something, but I think it would probably be difficult.
So the Palmer ratio, very interestingly, has been suggested as an alternative for measuring pay disparities. Do you think this or other measures might be more effective in really addressing wage inequality in South Africa? And why, or why not?
Yeah, firstly, I must just give a disclaimer. I'm not an economist, so
Right.
so I think that firstly, I think what is interesting is if you look at the Companies Act, I mean, it provides a lot of different ratios and matters that has to be disclosed in respect of the remuneration. So it talks about the average remuneration of all employees, the median remuneration, and then the ratio between the top 5% earners and the bottom 5% earners. And I think that's probably where the Palmer ratio comes in. Perhaps the Palmer ratio, because that, as I understand it, looks at the 10% highest earners and compare that to the 40% lowest.
Correct.
So it may be a good maybe a better benchmark, because it would probably be more representative. But ultimately, I think you probably have to look at all of these metrics holistically to come to a sensible outcome.
But what challenges might companies face in really implementing the new disclosure requirements? Are there particular sectors or company sizes where these challenges will be more pronounced here?
Yes, I think that I think for companies, especially companies where there will be a huge pay gaps, discrepancies, I mean, the fact that they definitely face challenges with disgruntled employees. I think, and not only just on the lower levels, you could also think that the mid levels could also be disgruntled. So I mean, there could be labor unrest, etc., in respect of this. I think that the sectors that would probably be more impacted would be, more the labor-intensive sectors. You're looking at agriculture and mining, for instance. I think sectors like maybe professional services, it will not be that stark, but that's probably where you would find the biggest issues.
So, Andre, while I do understand that you might be a bit challenged in responding to the next one, but how might the disclosure of pay gaps affect worker morale and company culture as well? Could it lead to increased demands for these wage adjustments from employees?
As we all know, that salaries is a very personal thing. A person almost regard that is what people see as your worth, what you earn. And when you see other people earning a lot more than you, it often leads to a lowering of morale. So I actually can't see that this disclosures will lead to better morale in the company. I think it would definitely lead to lowering of that. And definitely it would lead to demands for wage increases. And the point is that sometimes it may well be legitimate demands.
And as we wrap up our conversation, how do you expect different stakeholders, such as shareholders, labor unions, and even the general public, to react to the new pay gap disclosures? What impact might these reactions have on companies themselves?
I think what is interesting, it would be interesting to see how shareholders react to this, because ultimately shareholders will be the people that can approve these policies. And if they don't approve the policies, you can't implement it. So it would be interesting to see whether shareholders take an activist role and actually demand the narrowing of the gap, and demand the lowering of executive pay. So it is not clear how that's going to plan out, but the shareholders has the power actually to impact this and to influence the remuneration. Labor unions, I think in your preamble you said that they are very happy with this, and I can understand why, because it will be very interesting information that they will now have. And I think the general public would also be very interested in seeing this. So I think that it probably, the country that we live in, it would show huge discrepancies, and I think for companies it could actually probably be negative. It could be for their reputation if there's huge gaps. So ultimately they will have to actually manage this process and probably manage it through really looking at their remuneration policies and how they remunerate people.
André, let me thank you so much for your time. That's André de Lange sharing his detailed insights into the new company laws and also speaking to the implications as well.